Super heavy tanks off World War II and TO. Unpopular historical surveys treating tank development may reach back to war wagons and mobile forts, once drawn by no less a visionary than Leonardo da Vinci, as well as early examples and improvisations dating from Muscovian, the Hussite Rebellion. Although tanks and tank warfare also may claim antecedents in chariots and cavalry arms of the ancients, modern tanks reflect the evolution of siege machines. The inescapable fact remains that emerged as early innovations to break the deadlock of ground combat. In the 20th century, the super tanks of World War II owe their existence to the Siga machine tradition. As a class of fighting vehicle, they began in the World War I concept of the search for a breakthrough tank. Without earlier improvements to the internal combustion engine, metal fabrication, and rapid-firing weapons, their introduction would have been much delayed. The World War I Western Front provided the immediate military problem that caused their later development. We will classify the super heavy tanks as armored fighting vehicles of 70 metric tons or more. Borrowing from the briefly expounded U.S. Army ADO short tone criteria of 1946, there was never an international standard. Westhold not be surprised that the breakthrough tank projects of the period prior to World War II took place in the armies suffering the greatest casualties off the Great War: Russia, France, Germany. Herein we find the progenitors of the World War II super heavy tanks, worthy of mention in our introduction and concept development. Although only the French Army had on hand some of these super heavy breakthrough tanks at the beginning of World War II, the major Army Essenor or later began projects aimed at fielding updated versions of them, as well as equally super heavy tanks intended to dominate the armored battle. The latter category became the almost exclusive domain of the German Army, as it operated under the twin pressures of its diminishing operation prospects in the war, plus the increasingly convoluted activities of the industrial leadership. Although a very small number of super heavy tanks were built or so active World War II service in the armies of the major powers, it remains clear that their impressive appearance and specifications have captured the interest of armored fighting vehicle enthusiasts, pundits, and military personnel. Once discovered, the search is on for more information. In many respects, this appeal stems from the engineering feats undertaken by these projects, where improvisations of auto or locomotive manufacture often sufficed for smaller fighting vehicles. The super heavies exceeded the imagination of most contemporary tank users and designers and, even today, occupy the top shelf in the pantheon of tank and armored fighting vehicle history. Developing the super heavy tank, 1918-40, the first practical modern tanks, conceived and developed by the British Army, went into action on the Somme front. On September 15, 1916, they were large, rhomboid-shaped, armored tractors that contained machine guns, cannon, and crews within a single chassis. Protected against bullets and artillery shell fragments, their peculiar shape enabled trenches of up to 2.44 meters to be crossed. The descriptive term tank was applied largely as a security cover for their development by the British and supplanted the awkward, alternative term of landship, employed to cross barbed wire and destroy opposing machine gun positions. They gained increasing success in the war when employed en masse, with accompanying infantry and artillery support. Hundreds of tanks saw action in the following years in the British and French armies, including some lighter two-mina models, some featuring rotating turrets for employing weapons. The Germans managed to field only a few dozen machines for lack of incentive and, although the Allies developed faster machines, the tanks put into action remained, in general, walking limited and tied to an infantry support role in serving as a form of armor-red bittering ram or siege machine. By 1918, both the German and French armies planned a new generation of tanks that would play a decisive role in 1919, each hoping to break deadlock on the battlefield. The German General Staff took little. The K-Wagon remained very nautical in its arrangements, typical of early land. The commander and his gunnery officer observed from his cupola bridge and issued orders to the two drivers, helmsmen, who had no vision ports of their own. He issued orders to his batteries of gun sand, machine guns, to engun. They would have been transported by rail in sections of approximately 30 tons and assembled a few kilometers bin the front. Its scale model is paired here with the conventional A7V, which would have borne the lion's share of action had the war continued for the German army. Supported initially by the photo and models by Steven Zaloga, interest initially in tanks, which had not proved decisive at the outset, and in any case the plan for 1917 was to defend in the west while the decisive moves took place in the east. However, improvements in British tanks and the need to return to the offensive in the west provoked new policies in 1917. Slowly evolving A7V was ordered into low-rate production in early 1917, but further efforts were ordered before it was. A supporting John tank was proposed, Taugement the A7V, the Großkampfwagen K-Wagon with a planet size of 150 tons, sporting 4 77mm Fortress guns and 7 machine guns, and powered by 2 marine diesel engines. Finally, 10 vehicles were reordered on June 28, 1917, taking shape as somewhat smaller vehicles of around 120 tons. 2 bridge-building firms were contracted for their assembly, estimating a year to build. The track was adopted from excavation machinery. In October 1917, they were re-evaluated by the General Staff as suitable only for static warfare, not exploitation. By the armistice, 2 of the Kewagin were nearly completed, one without engines by Reeb Ballbering Works at Berlin, and another neared completion at Wegmann Carriage Works at Cassel. The Germans dismantled all under close inspection of the Allies. Char to CTHE French Army mostly followed the guidance of General Jean-Baptiste D'Ognan Estienne in the development and formation of its tank arm, leading, among many innovations, to the fielding of the FT-17 light tank, which had the first rotating turret and could be produced en masse as an infantry accompanying tank. Yet he also subscribed to a heavy tank concept, McKeever, and more tactically focused than the artillerie Dassault vehicles, such as the St. Chamond and Schneider. He saw the need for a heavy tank for every 3 to 4 light tanks as early as February 1917. The La Seine-Toulon shipyard of the Forges de Chantier de Méditerranée, FCM already had heavy tank designs in development, and with the encouragement of Estienne proposed a super heavy vehicle of some 68 tons, carrying a turret-mounted 75 mm gun, armored to at least 35 mm, capable of crossing trenches of 4.5 m. The ensuing political and military dialogue eventually produced a plan for a 3 under Char de C in Plan 1919. The armistice produced sharp markdowns and only 10 of the super heavies would be funded, once in hand. With the last Char de C delivered in 1921, the French Armée, the unique position of having such vehicles for experimentation, and subsequent development of doctrine for their employment, because of its age in 1939. The Char de C may be mistaken for an antique artifact of a bygone era. However, a number of breakthroughs were achieved in its engineering. It ranks as the first operational tank to weigh 70 metric tons. Some other firsts include our trench crossing in excess of 4 meters, 4.5 meters, achieved our mounting a long barrel 75 millimeters and an armored mounting an auxiliary machine gun turret for clearing trenches and rear protection, are mounting a machine gun in the hull fronter engine power over 500 HP, division of compartments, driver, fighting, and engine. The modern standard are unique. Use of stroboscopic viewing devices for its turretsil, though notions of heavy breakthrough tanks appeared in British, German, and Russian studies and plans between the wars. The French explored these concepts in greater detail. Thus, during the period 1918 to 1940, the French Army pursued a program of heavy tank development, beginning with the Char de C of 70 metric tons, and analyzed lessons and experiences drawn from World War I. The conception and construction of the Maginot Line also played an important part in the development of a series of French heavy and super heavy tank studies and designs. These emerging designs various lies to fight enemy tanks, halt enemy breakthroughs, assault enemy, and fit into the scheme of French defensive works, such as the Maginot Line. Studies initially worked around a specified maximum weight of 45 tons, but this factor increased because of additional armament, and by the late 1920s, the designs of Chars de fortress tanks called for 100-ton machines, protected by 100 to 150 mm armor plating and mounting high-velocity 75 mm cannon. By 1938, the requirement for 90 mm pneumatic cannon capable of firing against the embrasures of fortifications and employing flamethrowers entered into play. Various designs included a skeleton tank, an articulated tank, paired cannon, the installation of two turrets, a tank capable of being disassembled and transported by train, and a tank mounted on railway boogie wagons. The coming of World War II then caused some rapid decisions, and many proposals for tanks weighing 140 or even 220 tons. Therefore did not get off the drawing board. On April 13, 1940, the 8th meeting of the Commission on Fortress Tanks convened, viewing proposals from industry, and immediately ordered 10 vehicles from FCM, designated the F1, to be ready for operations in May-June 1941. The events of June 1940 made the order superfluous. This action, however, did most likely explain the strange odyssey of the old FCM-2C tanks, of which only 8 were capable of further service in 1939. Once re-engined with Maybach engines that had been held in they were taken as reparations in 1919, at first kept for possibly offensive operations against the Germans in the event the Poles held off the initial German attacks. Such deployment was cancelled, and the 51st Tank Battalion continued training using the FCM-2C, likely to maintain cadre for new, super heavy tanks expected to be produced during the war. Winter-geared to evacuate to the south by the Third Army, 2 tanks out of repair had to be destroyed. On June 13, 1940, the remaining 6 were rendered unusable. Days later, on their rail caught in the general withdrawal without their locomotives in a defile, with no chance of offloading, they were later hauled off to Germany as trophies and salvage. Initial progress too. 1940, design and specifications of Super Heavy Tank FCM. The FCM F1 order never progressed beyond the full-scale wooden mock-up the manufacturer had demonstrated to the Commission in order to win the. It does present a benchmark for the continued evolution of this type-off vehicle. However, in terms of technology and engineering, a true land battleship weighing 139 metric tons combat-loaded, it featured two turrets oriented to its various missions. The primary turret, raised to permit 360-degree rotation, carried a variation of the naval DCA model, 192,690 mm, L50L equals barrel length and calibers anti-aircraft, gun with 88 rounds. It was considered capable of sniping the weapon's embrasure-soft enemy forts, thereby knocking them out of action. This was a remarkable feat, considering that the characteristics of the German West Wall forts remained unknown to foreign intelligence. The second turret carried the model 1937 47mm anti-tank gun. With 100 rounds, this would have been the weapon of choice against tanks in Tank mission of stopping breakthroughs or operating in the Intervalseth, the Magina line, mounted forward. It had a blind zone of about 100 degrees of its rearward arc. 6 8mm Hotchkiss machine guns rounded out weaponry, dual mount in the bow, 30-degree arc, one each side 30-degree arc, and a gun in each turret. Armor protection averaged 100 mile around, sloped frontally to a maximum of 120 mm. The crew of 9 men, 3 fewer than that of the Chartisy, operated the weapons. Radios in D20 12-cylinder Renault KGM gasoline engines of 550 horsepower each, which powered the Allstall electrical drive system. Endurance of 200 kilometers on roads was planned, providing the 20 kilometers per hour top speed was sparingly used. As in Thuckies of the smaller Chartisy, rail transport required the use of special bogie heel assemblies to which the tanks were joined at each end via high. Accordingly, these tanks also had relatively narrow holes, because of required rail transport conditions. Had France managed to stop the German offensives in 1940, and had stalemate ensued as in 1914, the FCM F1 tanks could have entered service the next year, 6 months in advance of the first appearance of the German Tiger Heavy tank, together with the improved versions of the Char-B heavy tanks and the Samua medium tanks. The French army would have ironically fielded and operated the most modern tank force in the world during 1941-42 war and the tank programs. 1939-45, the opening moves of World War II. In Europe in 1939 brought to an end the period of experimentation conducted in the preceding decade. The German pattern of the Allums formation of tanks, mechanized infantry, engineers, artillery, and motorized logistic support, supported by tactical air power, became the new standard for the major warring powers. Developments of tanks and their components now settled upon 3 distinct classes of evolution: the light, medium, and heavy tank, for approximately 10, 25, and 50 tons. Although armies had expected the anti-tank guns to dominate the battlefield as they had in the Spanish Civil War, tank mobility, armor, and firepower had advanced sufficiently by 1940 such that a new paradigm operated. Instead of the machine guns and light cannon of the previous decade, tanks in World War II carried main guns of up to 152 mm bore, numerous machine guns, and even flame weapons or rocket launchers on occasion. Improved running gear and specially designed or modified engines permitted speeds in excess of 30 kph. The armor, by the end of the war, exceeded the penetration power of all but most unwieldy and heavy anti-tank artillery. Tank cannon now had to penetrate the armor of their opponents, and a number of specialized vehicles emerged for direct fire support assault guns, close support tanks, anti-tank missions, tank hunters or tank destroyers, reconnaissance, engineering, tank, and anti-aircraft roles. Most importantly, the operational doctrine for tank employment began to exploit not only the tank, but also accompanying mechanized troops of alarms, supporting aircraft in a fluid command style that permitted the exploitation of breakthroughs or weaknesses in the opposition forces, so that systemic collapses could be inflicted upon whole field armies. This doctrinal concept of rapid warfare, developed during the 1920s by the German army, took advantage of tank and mechanized equipment, developed in the 1930s Stowe effect, quick results on the battlefield, not feasible in the previous era of Foot 10 horsemobile armies. Through 1941, the German concept, dubbed Die Blitzkrieg in foreign quarters, worked well as long as opponents could not manage to respond to German maneuvers or attack their vulnerable logistics. TOG, super heavy tanks. British Army staff recognized at the outset of World War II that its tank arm had stagnated, despite some theoretical progress achieved via Experimentation Durnt in the 1930s, even as wartime production began to take form. The new Ministry of Supply sought novel designs and ideas to counter the bias. German advantages demonstrated in the campaign against Poland, even before the outbreak of war. The Secretary of State for War, Mr. Leslie Horbellische, had invited Sir Albert Stern to discuss mechanized warfare evolutions since 1918. On September 5 he notified Stern, who had headed the original landship program that developed the first British tanks in the previous war, that he welcomed his suggestion to explore the possibility after designing and constructing a special tank. By then 62 years of age and having returned to his banking profession, Stern reactivated many of his previous associates to join his new committee, including naval constructor Sir Eustace Dayencourt, Major General Sir Ernest Winton, Engineer Major Walter G. Wilson, and Sir William Tritton, the last CHAR-2C in battle, 1940. In September 1939, the 8 operational FCM-2C were held, ready in the fortified region for defense of the Maginot Line intervals during a German attack or to attack enemy fortifications in the event. The Poles held out and an attack on the Siegfried Line in the Saar region. However, engine problems and the deterioration of their electrical wiring made almost any movement a complex operation. In the fighting of June 1940, the High Command moved Theophilus out of the fighting front. But in this hypothetical situation, Third Army has ordered the 51st Tank Battalion into action on June 14, 1940, near Gap. Seeing elements of French cavalry tanks retreat, Lieutenant Colonel Fournet drove ahead of his 6 tanks in a sedan, and then stood aside as the lead tank 97. Normandy broke through the tree line and fired its 75mm gun into a pair of Panzer III medium tanks with devastating effect as the Panzer II light tanks scurried for cover and concealment, and the other 5 giants arrived. The victory was short-lived, however, as German Stuka dive bombers came upon the scene, and 3 of the Char-2C were left behind. Nevertheless, the crews were elated at finally having a chance to rub out several panzers. The 70-ton Char-2C carried a crew of 12 men, with dimensions of 10.27 meters long, 3 meters wide, and 3.8 meters high. It crossed trenches of 4.25 meters, climbed obstacles 1.7 meters high, and forded 1.4 meter streams. Maximum radius of action was 150 kilometers and maximum speed 12-15 kph. Armor consisted of 45mm front, 22mm side, 13mm top, 10mm bottom, 35mm forward turret, 22mm rear turret. TOG-1 demonstrates its excellent trench crossing capability at the Foster's plant. The side sponsons are not mounted, but were original Linton to house a 2PDR gun and Bessa machine gun each. But later, a turret was added, making these unnecessary. Photo, the Tank Museum. Bovington, an engineer and chairman of William Foster & Co., the firm that had prototyped the first British tank prototype, Little Willie. Wilson and Tritton had designed and developed the first Mark I tank prototypes and production versions, initially undertaken by the William Foster firm in 1916. After visiting France, the group formally convened under the Ministry of Science on October 12, 1939, as the Special Vehicle Development Committee, SVDC, but because of its origins quickly dubbed itself the Old Gang. Each charge was to act upon a specification, RBM 19 of the Imperial General Staff, September 28, 1939, for a super-heavy tank land battleship designated operate in France on the old World War I battlefields, and in the Samic. The details included immunity to 47mm anti-tank and 105 mH howitzer shots at 100 meters, and carrying a field gun capable of penetrating 2.13 mo free reinforced concrete, along with 2 standard 2-pounder weight of shell, common UK nomenclature, tank cannon, for machine guns, and for small. The requirement included a diesel engine capable of 8 km per hour for 80 km. The tank had to cross trenches 4.88 meters wide and climb obstacles 2.13 meters high and not exceed a ground pressure of 0.35 kilograms per centimeter 2. True to form, the committee had its preliminary design in hand by late December, with a wooden mock-up because of the power requirement. A new model diesel engine of the Paxman Ricardo type developing over 600 brp was needed and would be coupled to an original electrical drive that would alone bear the forces of weight and power and eliminate the problems of gear changing and mechanical transmission design that were foreseen. 2 pilot models were ordered, TOG-1, which was later converted to a hydraulic transmissions variant, TOG-1A, and the second model, TOG-2, with its tracks brought mostly inside the hull side armor. Initially, the tracks had no suspension system, but moved over rollers. The same 2 pilots would bear built several times in ensuing years as their designs changed, because of the focus upon tracked vehicle experiences in Flanders during World War I. The TOG designs emphasized the need for low ground pressure, vertical and trench crossing performance, heavy armor, and a powerful tank cannon, when no gun capable of tank use could be found, that pierced the specified 2.13 meters of concrete. The ubiquitous French 75mm field gun was chosen as next best, to be hull-mounted in front. The use of sponsons for the 2PDR and machine guns was later rejected as too ungainly, and instead a conventional Matilda to tank turret and side-mounted machine guns were to be installed. The resulting tank design under construction for an October 1940 delivery by Foster's now weighed 68 metric tons. Armor by this point was 3 and 76.2 millimeters all round. By using 0.84 meters track plates, a ground pressure of 0.61 kilograms per square centimeter was achieved. Thanks to its length of 10.52 meters and track height of 2.13 meters, it would cross a 4.5 meters trench and climb a 1.66 meters obstacle dot with its width of 3.05 meters. The tank would remain transportable by rail without disassembly. Asterisk trials undertaken by the TOG-1 in November 1940 demonstrated problems for the electric Caltransons, as well as difficulties with steering because of the extreme length-to-width ratio of the hull and tracks. When the transmission caught fire, the committee decided to rework TOG-1 and fit it with a Sinclair hydraulic transmission. The resulting TOG-1A was running well in June 1943 at 11.14 kph WHEN. Final drive weaknesses again threw design into doubt. Its final test run in December 1943 produced track roller failures, and that terminated its activities after 271 engine hours of total operation. On August 21, 1944, TOG-1 was shipped to Chobham on a 100-ton transporter. A letter of July 14, 1947, reported that its engine and motors provided variable speed drives for test beds. Work on the second prototype, the TOG-2, began on June 27, 1940, at Fostas. It was delivered in March 1941. The main difference in this designate in the reduced vulnerability of the tracks rendered by dropping them from the front idler wheel to a level below the fighting compartment, leaving more internal room and at the same stroke placing the upper track behind the side armor. Secondly, the main armament was placed in a turret instead of the hull. The propulsion system remained diesel-electric drive. Sponsons for mounting additional guns were again considered but latter dropped. However, for rail transport, the larger turret required dismounting for vertical clearance. 4 turrets were developed for the TOG-2, initially to mount the 3-in entire craft gun, but the last for the 17-pounder, 76.2 mm anti-tank gun, plus 2 coaxial Besa machine guns. Depression was -10 and elevation +20 degrees. A2. In smoke mortar was fitted to the left of the gun mount. The 17 PDR gun was probably an overmatch for the tank. Despite its size, when on an 11-degree slope, neither hand nor electrical drive could traverse the turret. Ammunition carried was 8 503-inch shells, 4,800 rounds of 7.79 mm Besa, and 32 in-bombs for the mortar. The committee planned on producing the TOG-2 for immediate use against the Axis ground forces in North Africa. Designated the TOG-2R, the production version weighed 61.7 metric tons. A document signed on November 26, 1941, estimated the cost off air filters for TOG-2R. U.S. equipment already in use in the Middle East. For tanks and armored cars, Stern submitted a note on heavy tanks to the Army Tank Board on June 13, 1941, criticizing inadequate appropriation for the future. The Army continued to order more infantry and cruiser tanks. He had warned the Prime Minister in April 1940 that only such out-of-date tanks would be available for fighting in 1941. Now, none of them could carry the 6 PDR 57mm gun. The SVDC had continually advocated the 6 PDR tank gun, but, in July 1940, the General Staff protested against mounting this gun. The guns had now been ordered and there were no tanks to carry them. The SVDC had produced the TOG-2 weighing 62 to 80 metric tons, which would carry heavier armor than any known tank and a high-velocity gun twice the size of even the 6 PDR, either the naval 12 PDR 7.62 mm or the 3 inches. It was specially designed for rapid manufacture, with the capability for at least 50 TOG-2s to be produced for the campaign of 1942, and probably more like 100. First it had to pass acceptance testing. However, this process began on July 2, 1941, at Farnborough. The vehicle was prepared for all but the 500-mile reliability test. Because the track was not in proper condition after preliminary runs and demonstrations, the vehicle weighed 51 metric tons with its wooden turret. Matching vehicles in the test were Valentine and Matilda, Mk2 infantry tank *TOG-2, arrived overnight and was driven to the test site and fueled. That afternoon, that tank board arrived and the test began. The TOG-2 crossed 2 infantry trenches that could not be crossed by either of the infantry tanks, a 3.66 meters wide trench, and a combination of. It then negotiated the official tank trap with the greatest ease. A point-to-point tryst then ensued over a half-mile course afro ground. The 2 infantry tanks covered it in 1 min 30 sec and 1 min for 5 sec. The TOG-2 in 2 minutes. The 2 infantry tanks then were stopped by a trench, the Valentine throwing a track. TOG-2 completed the course, and later breached barbed wire that was thought capable of throwing the tracks off the other tanks. TOG-2 and the Matilda 2 then completed the 2-mile cross-country course without mishap. although TOG-2 needed a 30 minutes break to cool down its electric motor temperature, which had reached 40 degrees. The next day saw hill climbing and tarmac top speed tests, and on a downhill run the brakes failed and the vehicle reached 24 kilometers per hour. Amid the smoking engine compartment, mechanics discovered that an electric motor had exploded with considerable damage. A new braking system was designed for TOG-2R. The next field test at Farnborough took place January 1, 1942. WITH TOG-2R tested against Matilda II and the new Churchill tank A-22. Essentially all three tanks performed well, but the TOG-2R was bested in every category except for trench crossing. Time had caught up with TOG-2R, and newer components for steering, braking, transmissions, and hydraulics were available that made the heavy and cumbersome diesel-electric clant of the TOG questionable. Moreover, the appearance of the Rolls-Royce Meteor tank engine offered significant power-to-weight advantages over the Paxman Ricardo diesel. On April 23, 1943, Churchill escaped that 200, preferably 400, Churchills befitted with the heaviest armor possible, with at least 100 pushed forward as an. At the same time, he refereed the experimental development of a Hy-Vee tank at 67 or 80 tons and asked for a report on the Stern tank. On May 3, the tank board determined it thought the Stern tank had nothing to offer by comparison to the Churchills. Instead, it was proposed that Super Heavy tank be studied for any technical improvements of value. It bode no good for the TOG series that a few months later, a German Tiger tank arrived from Sicily almost intact and ready for exploitation. Reports described it as a 58 tank with a fluid drive transmission with couplings and hydraulic steerage. The transmission control was pre-selected, hand-operated change of speeds based upon a final trial in May 1944 of the 80 metric ton TOG-2*, pronounced TOG-2 star, upgunned with the 17 PDR cannon and fitted with torsion bar suspension. The Department of Tank Design officially closed the TOG-2 project because of the steering problems that had plagued Thea Design since. 1941, shipped to Chobham on June 2, 1943. It is the same tank that rests today in the Tank Museum. Bovington, a proper epitaph, came years later from Vernon Clear, a Merritt Brown engineer who worked in British tank development from 1932 to the mid-1960s. That the TOG vehicles were permitted to be built was an extraordinary thing and illustrates how Churchill was vulnerable to persuasion by some of his World War I associates. They were designed and built independently of the established tank design and development. Channel sand were quite impractical for the situation in World War II. The vehicles were a complete waste of money, time, and effort, and I never ceased to be amazed that it was allowed to happen. KV-2 for Super Heavy Tank Project between the wars. The Red Army design bureaus occasionally studied heavy tanks, approaching the super heavy category, but found no basis for using them beyond the theoretical breakthrough tank. In the events that followed, their heavy tank developments generally provided such functions, although with design weaknesses. Because the early years of the Russo-German War were so closely fought for the essential survival of the Soviet Union, there was little choice in priorities for the tank industry but to maximize production off the existing models of light, medium, and heavy tanks, with only the most fundamental upgrades. Certain wartime projects for super heavy tanks existed, however, principally because of the experiences of the Russo-Finnish War of 1939-40 and the difficulties experienced in overcoming Finnish resistance despite Russian superiority in numbers and equipment. In particular, the calls by General for a heavy gun tank capable of destroying their enforced bunkers his troops had encountered on the Mannerheim Linie prompted several projects in the aftermath of the campaign, resulting in THEKV-2 artillery tank with a 152 mm howitzer mounted in an ungainly Terrathot, overloaded the already problematic KV-1 heavy tank design. The Dessen team of Joseph Cotton turned to even larger, heavy, and super heavy designs in a search for a solution. A KV-3, 4, and 5 series was undertaken. The first Bung, an enlarged KV-1 heavy tank, and the next two super heavy tanks. The projects became complicated by the unwelcome intervention of Marshal Gregory Kulik, who headed the Red Army's main artillery directorate, an uncannily misguided commander, who frequently misjudged military. He had become convinced that the current tank cannon would outclassed soon by the Germans, and he halted further projects such as an 85 mm tank gun and forced development of a ZIS-6, 107 mm F-42 cannon, which was not ready by the time the Russo-German War began. The Kirov factory Leningrad of Cotton pursued the heavier tanks and managed to complete a prototype KV-3 hull, but no progress was made on fabricating the super heavy KV-2-4 and KV-5 because of the conditions posed by the siege of Leningrad. However, Cotton did collect concepts and drawings from as many as 22 designers for the KV-4 super heavy tank, which was conceived as a breakthrough tank that also could defeat any known German tank or likely successor. In these varied designs, the weights ranged from 86 to 108 metric tons, and armor. from 125mm on the side to 130mm on the hull front. All carried the 107mm main gun, and all but one design featured a secondary anti-tank gun of 45 to 76mm, plus 2 to 4 machine guns. All designs would use the M40 diesel aircraft engine, RATED, at 1,200 horsepower. British TOG-2R. This TOG-2R appears as it might have if deployed to 8th Army in the Western Desert. Despite its weaknesses, the TOG-2 could have brought a powerful gun and sturdy armor protection to the 8th Army at a critical point in the 1942 North African campaign, particularly if the supply of M4 medium tanks by the United States had lagged. Accordingly, this planned production version, designated TOG-2R, might have been assigned to the 50th Royal Tank Regiment, 23rd Armored Brigade, in late 1942, weighing 62 metric tons. With 75mm hull armor, it would have carried the 3-in-gun 85 to 100 rounds carried, with a Besa coaxial machine gun and a turret protected with 7.5 MUF armor on a 9.5mm shell all around. With a 38.1mm roof plate, electric drive traversed it on the 1.68 meters turret ring and allowed -10 plus 20 degrees of elevation. The roof featured a 2-inch smoke mortar, 30 rounds left of the mount, and periscope sights. With the commander's cupola copied from V-22 Churchill tank. TOG-2 specifications: length, WO gun, 953 m, width, 2.97 m, heights, 2 hull, 2.13 meters, 2 turret top, 3.35 meters, ground clearance, 0.5 m, tracks, shoe 0.76 meters wide, length of track on ground with no sinkage, 3.2 m, performance, can climb a 35-degree slope and a 1.5 meters obstacle and cross a 3.96 meters trench. Top speed is 14.5 km/h with 757 liters of fuel. It operates for 160 km mobility. Turning radius at speed is 9.1 meters, but remains capable of a neutral steer at halt. Crew 6 commander, gunner, loader, driver, machine gunner, and assistant loader, radio operator. For a planned speed of 35 to 50 km per hour, the 107mm ZZ6 would penetrate 115 MUF armor plate, sloped 30 degrees at 1,000 meters. However, the Kirov factory had to cut back most production activities in the fall of 1941. In the end, none of the 600 ZIS-6 guns produced on Kulik's orders, Equipani tanks, except for a KV-2 proving ground test rig, and all were scrapped BES. No tanks had been produced for them. The Soviet Super Heavy projects were shelved as production waned at Khotin's Leningrad factory, and the tank plants built or transferred to the Urals concentrated on T-30 for mediums. And eventually, the A-series heavy tanks with which Russia finished the war, German Super Heavy, unlike the British and Russian armies. The German army faced tanks, of superior size, armor, and firepower from the outset of World War II. Although Panzerwaffen handled the Polish campaign with few technical problems, war with France meant confronting superior, heavy, and medium tanks, Suchaza, Vicharbi, and Sup, armed with 47mm high-velocity cannon. Penetrated German tank armor with ease. French infantry employed anti-tank weapons in the same caliber, and a portion of their 75mm field guns were detailed as anti-tank guns in support of frontline troops. Even greater challenges emerged with the Russo-German War, for the Germans had no initial answer to the KV-1 heavy tank and T-34 medium tank except for improvised use of the 88mm anti-aircraft guns, and eventually improved ammunition for their standard 50mm tank and anti-tank guns. Under a pre-war requirement for a breakthrough tank, the Henschel Works eventually produced the heavy PZK WWII Tiger tank that would not enter production until August 1942. Its first operational deployment took place on the Leningrad front in late September of the same year. The real response by Germany to the Russian tanks came with the fielding of 75 Manta tank guns and the hurried design and production of the nearly 50-ton medium PZK PFWV Panther tank that entered service in May 1943. Among the many effects of the Russo-German War, the successive mechanical shocks of superior tanks introduced by each side produced a gun armor race that continued in some manner even after the war's end. For the Russians, their continuing requirement for mass production limited Thiventors they could effect, and so they upgunned their T-34 285mm guns and replaced the KV series with Izraelshevy tanks carrying 122mm guns. Any further ventures had to await end of the war, hence the abandonment of their super heavy tank projects for the time being. The Germans, however, placed a premium on technological quality and superiority over math, for which their industry, and, arguably, their regime remained rather unsuited. Not satisfied with the advantage they attained with the Tiger and Panther series tanks, the army leadership and Adolf Hitler himself pushed for larger and more powerful tanks than had ever been built. The tank project illustrated best the increasing influence of civilian contractors and political leadership upon German tank design and production that ran contrary to the previous routine among army departments and contractors. The German army bureaus acted on November 1, 1941. Toth's situation in Russia to specify a future super heavy tank in the 70 metric ton class. Because the Krupp Works had lost out on the Panther tank contract, the Army approached them to pursue the project, stating an upper limit of 90 tons for the projected vehicle. In February 1942, with the situation in Russia deteriorating, the Army awarded Krupp a contract for 2 VK7001 prototypes in the 72-ton class, with the 800 horsepower Maybach HL230 engine, Tiger drivetrain, and armor, and a 105mm 70 cal gun. The intention was to go into series production as soon as the prototypes were delivered. In April, that project became the WWII tank, PZK PFW7. Almost immediately, this tank project obtained Hitler's interest, and in conference with Armaments Minister Albert Speer on March 5 to 6, he directed Krupp to develop a 100-ton tank to be ready for testing before the spring of 1943. The designers created a 90-ton shim beginning in April. However, by this time Hitler was convinced that the heavier Russian tanks would appear by that spring, and that German tanks must be readied on a 100 to 120-ton basis. The Porsche firm had already received an army contract for a 100-ton tank in March, and in late June Hitler approved drawings for the Porsche 100-ton tank, to be armed with either the 105 Fem or a new 150mm cannon. Krupp was to build the turret and receive the contract on July 17. The WWII tank previously ordered by the Army was cancelled on May 18, hull and July 20 turret. Both the Porsche and Krupp firms initially competed for an enlarged and heavier tank in the 150 to 170-ton range, carrying a 150mm and 75mm dual armament. By this point, the tank's concept had reverted to field breakthrough tank role, so a slower speed and infantry support mission supplanted any particular notion of dueling with enemy tanks in a fluid battlefield, which would have taken place in any case as the war narrowed the defense of the Reich. The Krupp contract called for the heavy PZK PFW8 Maus turret, but the Army procurement officers had urged the firm to continue work on a lighter design that would make use of as many Tiger tank components as possible. In view of Professor Porsche's difficulties with his Tiger design, then in its final stages, this move also reflected the Army Bureau's frustration with the meddling of industrialists and politicians in Army procurement processes. The Krupp project received formal approval. On November 10, leading initially to the E100 vehicle, Dr. Porsche presented his firm's drawings for a 170-ton tank on November 17, calling for a turret placed on the vehicle rear with engine forward of it, generators under the turret, and electrical propulsions at the rear. The heavy armor included most of the suspension. British TOG-11 prototype TOG-1 was built. Specifications are from the Draft Operator's Manual, the Tank Museum Library. Bovington turret, 1x2 PDR 40mm, 1x Besa machine gun. Sponsons, 2x Besa machine guns, each 30 minutes Toratract sponsons. Hull front, 1x75mm gun, 1x Besa, crew of 8, when sponsons mounted. Propulsion Paxman Ricardo, 1.2, VTP water-cooled, V12 diesel. Rated 550 bsp, at 1,500 revolutions per minute. Electric drive 2x generators. 2x English electric motors. Radius of action, 96.5 kilometers on 757 liters of fuel. Air brakes, speed on level, 11-13 kph. Dimensions, length, 10.5 meters. Height, 2.13 meters. Hull top, 3.23 meters. Turret top, width, 4.72 meters. Sponsons out, 3.05 meters, sponsons in. Weight 68 metric tons. Climb, 40-degree slope at 1.6 kilometers per hour for 5 minutes. 1.68 meters. Vertical obstacle, crosses a 4.6 meters trench. Hold side slope up to 40 degrees without turning over. Track shoes, 92, each side. Pitch 241 millimeters. Projection of shoes 62 millimeters. Link pins 32 millimeters. Weight off shoe and pin, 45.8 kilograms. Ground pressure, 1.46 kilograms per square centimeter on hardstand, with 305 millimeters sinkage in soil, 0.61 kilograms per square centimeter. A final proposal from the TOG committee for this vehicle would have made use of the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, but still retained the electric drive, which they thought essential for such a heavy tank. 2. Soviet KV-4. The KV-4 did not progress beyond the drawing board. KV-4 designs in Khotan's bureau, mostly Kaled for 2 turrets, for main and secondary cannon, but by 1941, multi-turret tanks already were industry. Given the difficulties of wartime production, this illustration presumes that Khotan chose only single turret design, that of end sights for the KV-4 prototype. Furthermore, he rejected the cylindrical turret of that design in favor of a modified KV-3 turret as a further economy of effort. The specifications are: dimensions, length, 8.35 meters, width 4.03 meters, height, 3.62 meters, ground clearance, 0.55 meters, track bearing length, 6.05 meters, combat weight, 90 tons, crew, 6 armor hull, 130 mm front, 125 mm side, 125 mm rear, turret, 140 armament, 1 by 107 mm, 2 x 7.62 mm DT machine guns. A prototype could have been built in 1942 if it had been. Perhaps it would have been either mentioned in the factory or sacrificed in the defensive battles of Leningrad, and track. Hitler ordered the Porsche Mazinto production during a January 3 to 5, 1943 meeting, with an Alkit factory slated for the assembly of 10 units per month for an eventual total of 6 prototypes and 135 operations. Hitler decided on the 128 mm but ordered a turret finished with a 150 mm gun for future consideration. With the current Krupp turret required to carry either measure cancelled by the army in June 1944, continuing Hitler's fixation with runaway technology, he professed that tanks in hand, such as Tiger and Panther for 1943, could maintain superiority only for a year, and Mao's on to the King Tiger B would therefore bear 1944. Design efforts culminated in the presentation of a full-size wooden model to Hitler on March 13, 1943. He had previously ordered the production of the first vehicle by May 1943, which would have frozen the design work effective that very March as he gazed upon the mock. These measures proved too ambitious, and in January, the deadline for the first vehicle was reset instead to September 1943, with 4 more ordered completed by year. The desired production rate remains set at 10 units per month. Disaster twice struck the Krupp works at Essen. A bombing raid on the night of March 5/6, 1943 destroyed the engineering worksheets and drawings for the Maus turret, and burned a wooden engineering mock-up. The first turret livery slowed from mid-October to at least 2 more months. The armored hull assembly line was unmolested. However, a second air raid in early August effectively killed the project. The first 10 hulls survived, but would take more time for finishing. The first 2 could be sent to Alkit once debris was cleared. Armor plates existed for another 30 vehicles. Turrets remained a different matter. However, the first turret was delayed until December by destroyed companies, and no others could be worked on until such parts were located. The damaged armor works restored to operation. A later estimate delayed further hull and turret production for 7 to 8 months. In response, the Army cancelled production of the Maus on October 27 in order to concentrate on ongoing production of other vehicles. 1 Maus turret and 2 hulls would be completed and shipped to Alkit. This was the only known destruction of armored vehicle production by strategic bombing in history. Alkit tracks were cancelled or modified for the closeout. By November 12, dispatch fillers put out to restart production by industry leaders. The Army gave up permission on July 27, 1944, for Krupp to scrap the next 4 hulls that remained in its shops, so as not to obstruct current production. Krupp shipped the first Maus hull to Alkit on September 26, 1943. The second Maus arrived from Alkit on March 20th, requiring finishing AF Tank Park. Its turret arrived from Krupp Works on May 4th and was installed on June 8th. Manual traverse was attempted on a 10-degree slope, and it required 30 kilograms of force to accomplish. Power steering was not yet available, but failed when energized in early July. Fuel consumption then was noted as 350 liters per 10 kilometers. Although engine defects may have accounted for some of this poor performance, the flat track plates were considered unusable and cleated track was ordered as replacements. Their placement of the track in the tank park required 6 men and 8 with the second prototype on hand. The evaluation of the powering of one tank through an electrical cable to another engaged in forwarding Provitsu. On November 19, 1944, Krupp returned its workers to Essen on orders of the Army Procurement Bureau, and further work on the Maus was ordered to cease. Hitler had already ordered all development of tanks with heavy guns, stopped on July 21, but the armaments industry had its own. The 2 vehicles moved to the Kummersdorf testing facility before the end of the year, where they apparently remained non-operational. 1. French FCMF 1. The FCMF-1 reflected the 2 decades of French experience with their fortress tanks. As usual, the limitations of rail transport required a long and narrow hull, relative to overall size. These limited several design options and made the length-to-width ratio a difficult prospect for steering and turning radius. As with the FCM-2C of 1919, this Char de Fortress would have used the special rail bogie system for transport. Specifications: dimensions: weight 139 metric tons, length 10.53 meters, width 3.10 meters, height 4.21 meters, 3.74 meters, less turret agility, ground clearance 0.45 meters, Fording depth 2.33 meters. Vertical obstacle 1.3 meters. Trench crossing 4.5 m radius, 200 kilometers on roads. Had the French continued in the war, the follow-up to this vehicle would have seen the development of a gun firing shells, with 150 to 200 kilograms of high-explosive filler to destroy thick concrete fortifications. But such a piece did not yet exist. The Commission on Fortress Tanks thought that such guns of 135 to 155 millimeters would be required for a new tank once this transitional F1 design had been placed into operation. 2. German MA. The Maus design, the driver, and radio operator remained isolated from the rest of the tank in the forward hull. Using a single overhead hatch for entry and exit, the 75mm gun originally was Taube, the short 24 caliber gun from Pruth, but the muzzle had to be extended to 36 calibers to keep propellant gases out of the engine intakes on the whole top. Specifications: dimensions 9.02 meters chassis length, 10.085 meters overall with gun forward, 3.67 meters wide, 3.63 meters to ground clearance was 0.57 meters. The main gun is 2.774 meters above ground. Center of tube weight 188 metric tons. Planned crew 6 armament 128 millimeters L55, 175 millimeters L36, and 7.92 millimeters MG34 machine gun. Elevation 7 plus 23 degrees. Ammunition 55 rounds of 128 millimeters, 200 rounds 75 on performance. Max speed 20 kilometers per hour. Radius of action on roads 160 kilometers. FORDING 2.0 meters or with submersion kit 6.0 meters. Obstacle clearance 0.75 meters. Trench crossing 3.48 m. Automotive. Interim Daimler-Benz MB509 V12 gasoline engine developing 1,540 horsepower at 2,500 revolutions per minute. 2x generators, 2x electric motors, rear sprocket drive, 6 paired sets of road wheels per side, coil spring suspension, track width 1.1 meters. The Red Army approached Kummersdorf. The second vehicle with its turret was destroyed by the garrison. There remains no evidence of their use in the Russians eventually placed the turret on the first prototype Fortesting, and it now rests at the Kubinka Tank Museum, E100. As noted in the Maus history, the Army had encouraged the Krupp engineers to pursue a competitive Maus project, in which Tiger tank components would be used to maximum effect in order to save weight and improve Although the Porsche design finally was designated the Saal Malus project, the Army managed to develop Krupp's Malus as the E100 project. The Entwicklung development series of vehicles created by Thermi procurement bureaus ostensibly aimed at a series of fighting vehicles in successive weight classes that would share components and offer Commonality design as an overall economy measure. The reality remained that these designs frequently had no basis in the Army program but were intended to dissuade the industrialists from using their access to Hitler and other leaders in order to press new programs that the Army neither needed nor desired. At the same time, the E-Series vehicles demonstrated the requirement to limit further growth in external dimensions because of cost, weight, and transport penalty, because the size and required number of projectiles also had increased during the war. The new designs freed more internal volume forçatus by abandoning torsion bar suspensions in favor of externally mounted ones, and also by placing all engine drive components in the rear, thus eliminating the powertrain extending through the driver's only in the largest vehicle class, the E100. Was this last measure initially not feasible? Although a new rear hull-mounted power pack remained with the designers as a future possibility, although the Krupphaus design was adopted as the basis for the E100 project, the Army procurement officers did not think Krupp could adapt such project to its manufacture. Accordingly, the Adler Automotive Works of Frankfurt was designated as the contractor, working with Army Weapons Office from June 30, 1943 to finish the pilot design, which they would assemble at Sinaleja Army Base. Work progressed slowly, as your indication of the priorities of these series. By January 15, 1944, the Army reported the chassis assembly at Paderborn was almost complete, but practically stolid because of delays caused by parts not arriving or related wartime difficulties such as Only 3 Adler workers labored at that point at the assembly site. In particular, the Belleville system suspension spring units, combat track, 1 meter wide, fuel lines and transmission cover plate, had yet to be delivered. The workers could complete neither the suspension assembly nor the electrical system in the driver's compartment, asterisk for lack of a better motor. The Maybach HL230 had to be installed as a temporary measure. Most serious, though, was the absence of a turret, for which the Army report lacked information. Krupp had supposedly designated a turret for the E100 by May 1944. That had saved weight compared with one from their original mouse project of the previous year. It had thinner plates with a sloped front and mounted the 75mm gun on top of the 128mm, a most unusual arrangement. Dr. Carl Jenscha, the technical director and chief constructor of the ED, considered the E100 an obsolete design once accepted. Post-war he testified that rail movement required removing the outermost road wheels, outer sprocket and idler wheel rings, and suspension armor, and then fitting transport track. He considered the proposed heavy armament of either a 150mm or 170mm gun to be feasible only as an assault gun variant, because its turret space could not accommodate loading such weapons. Krupp was supposedly manufacturing the turret, but had been delayed. A deadweight tunnet would have served for initial trials. The E-100 hull was captured in early April 1945 by advancing U.S. troops. Little more had been accomplished, and the suspension could not even mount the combat track that had finally arrived. There is no record of a turret being gambled for it, and the project was likely abandoned. The ill-fated Maus project did contribute to the sole German super-heavy fighting vehicle completed, and indeed the largest and most powerful operational one of World War II. The Maus specifications eventually centered upon a direct conversion of the 128mm anti-aircraft gun, model Flak 40, produced since 1942 by Rheinmetall Borsig with a barrel length of 61 calibers. Krupp undertook the redesign, resulting in the 128mm Pak 44 anti-tank cannon, later renamed 128mm Panzerkanone 80, using ABRL 55 calibers long. No equilibrator was fitted, and the resulting mounting minding barrel heavy, reducing the possibility of lengthening it for hire. After their review of the wooden model, the Army bureaus had made several changes, some of them major. There would be no ports for firing Sebastian guns. Separate loaded ammunition for the 128mm gun was finally accepted. Frontal armor for the fighting compartment increased to 250mm. A 70 caliber barrel proposal was abandoned, and indirect firing capability was discarded. Asterisk on the other hand, some interruption to the production effort came from the irrepressible Dr. Porsche, who nominated the suspension system from his unsuccessful Tiger tank prototype that had been converted to a similar heavy tank destroyer. It consisted of 4 paired roadwheel trucks on each side, using a longitudinal torsion bar to stabilize each pair. Because of the simplicity and the external mounting of the suspension with simple screws, the Porsche suspension saved 1.2 metric tons and 450 man-hours of work on each vehicle. It also saved some internal volume and raised the ground clearance 100mm, compared with the Henschel torsion bar suspension with 9 road wheels per side. Asterisk among the initial vehicles assembled, the first 2 delivered in February 1944 had the Porsche and Henschel suspensions mounted respectively by Performance. Accordingly, no muzzle brake was fitted to avoid any reduction in muzzle velocity. The resulting weapon remained very fragile, and a folding travel lock as well as an internal gun lock was required to avoid knocking the weapon out. The Army Procurement Bureau first approached the Krupp firm on February 2, 1943, with its proposal for a heavy tank Hunter mounting the 128 gun on the chassis of the King Tiger B, heavy tank, slated for production by Henschel starting late that year. The concept of employment stated the need for an infantry support weapon capable of fighting at ranges of 3,000 meters. Firepower and armor protection were given priority over mobility, although good off-road capability, including mud and snow, was desired. The orders at first called for frontal armor at 200mm, while Krupp held responsibility for producing the gun up to the armor attached to the gun cradle. Also, designingly required mantled armor. The production of the vehicle rested with the Henschel firm. It would lengthen its Tiger B chassis by 410mm in order to accommodate the new design. Specifications. Hitler approved the project on August 21, 1943, and Henschel had a full-scale wooden model ready to show him on October 20th. Construction had already begun on the first hull at the Eisen Works at Orbadon. It finished that November and was followed by 3 more the next month. Final assembly and series production began at the nearby Belungen Works, St. Valentin, in December, and the first 2 vehicles rolled out in February. 1944. They began the required testing for all vehicles at Komorsdorf on May 5, 1944. After their review of the wooden model, the Army bureaus had made several changes, some of them major. There would be no ports for firing Sebastian guns. Separate loaded ammunition for the 128mm gun was finally accepted. Frontal armor for the fighting compartment increased to 250mm. A 70 caliber barrel proposal was abandoned, and indirect firing capability was discarded. On the other hand, some interruption to the production effort came from the irrepressible Dr. Porsche, who nominated the suspension system from his unsuccessful Tiger tank prototype that had been converted to a similar heavy tank destroyer. It consisted of 4 paired roadwheel trucks on each side, using a longitudinal torsion bar to stabilize each pair. Because of the simplicity and the external mounting of the suspension with simple screws. The Porsche suspension saved 1.2 metric tons and 450 man-hours of work on each vehicle. It also saved some internal volume and raised the ground clearance 100 millimeters. Compared with the Henschel torsion bar suspension with 9 road wheels per side, among the initial vehicles assembled, the first 2 delivered in February 1944 had the Porsche and Henschel suspensions mounted respectively. Testing during May revealed a serious vibration and pitching problems with Porsche system, which abated only when exceeding 14 to 15 km per hour on a hard surface road. Shear forces could break the wheel units from the hull, and wheel loading increased track wear and breakage. The decision was made to manufacture only the Henschel version, but a total of 11 vehicles had to be finished with the Porsche suspension by September. This incident, as well as ordered acceleration of PZK-PFW for medium tank manufacture at the Nibelungen works, caused a certain delay in production that was not helped by a damaging bombing raid in mid-October following the first 2 vehicles. The Nibelungen plant assembled 3 Jaguars each in July-August, then 8, 9, and 6 each following month until the record 20 delivered in December. On October 12, 1944, the Army fixed the total order for this vehicle at 150, after which production would shift to Tiger B heavy tanks. Hitler intervened in January 1945, however, ordering production to continue and to accelerate if possible. The Army hesitated to implement this command, and hedged it by ordering only 100 more from Nibelungen works, transferring production in May 1945 to the Jung firm, which had no experience in assembling fighting vehicles. Some 88 of that Jaguar model were completed in all, with at least 4 fitted with 88 Mechanion because of shortages. Most of the last 8 likely never left the factory and were supposedly destroyed before the Red Army took the plantain May 9, 1945. An example of this vehicle may be seen today at the Tank Museum, Bovington with Porsche suspension, the Ordnance Training and Heritage Museum, Ft. Lee, Virginia, and the Russian Tank Museum at Kubinka. Technically, the Jag Tiger remained a highly advanced tank destroyer, fitted with a binocular gunner's periscope sight of 10x magnification, with range scales of 0 to 4,000 meters and 0 to 8,000 meters, for armor-piercing and high-explosive ammunition respectively. The 128mm 55 cannon penetrated 148mm of armor sloped 30 degrees at 2,000 meters and 167mm at 1000 m. In operation. However, the vehicle displayed serious limitations because of its sheer size and mobility, frequency of breakdown, and difficulties in the development of the OI, and an earlier 100-ton tank by the Japanese Navy reflected the basic requirement for building the strongest feasible tank, just as the Japanese Navy had worked on the world's largest battleship in the 1930s. The impetus for a 100-ton tank project stemmed directly from the defeat inflicted by the Red Army in the Nomenhan-Kalkangal incident of 1939. The Army staff issued a top-secret order for a gigantic tank that can be used as a mobile pillbox on the Great Plains of Manchuria. In 1948, 100-ton super heavy prototype was built. Its general appearance resembled Type 95 heavy tank. The main armament was a Type 90 to 105mm cannon, which had been tested before on the chassis of the older Type 95. Smaller turrets were present on both the front and rear of the tank, but their number was not yet specified. The suspension consisted of coil springs. After Scheding's own suspension during tests, the 100-ton tank was cancelled and the prototype scrapped. However, by 1944, the military situation for Japan had come desperate. Some information on super heavy tank development in Germany came to Japan, and that rekindled the idea of a new giant. Development restarted with a new super heavy tank designated the O. The main armament in the central turret was once again the Type 90 to 105 mm cannon, a modified field gun. 2 small turrets topped the front hull, offset slightly left from the midpoint of the tank. One carried a Type 147 Manta tank gun, and the other a Type 97 7.7mm tank machine gun. On the rear hull, 2 similar heavy machine gun turrets completed the armament. Armor was a maximum thickness of 150mm. The suspension consisted of coil springs providing torsion to a bogie, suggestive of a modified Porsche road-wheel truck system. The power plant consisted of 2 modified BMW aircraft type air-cooled gasoline engines, which gave a total of 1,100 horsepower. This same modified engine was also used in the Type 5 Shirei medium tank. The 2 engines were placed lengthwise parallel to each other in the rear. The structure of the transmission was the same as the Type 97 Chiha, although the gears were. The 5-speed forward gear lever was in center front of the driver and both hands were used to adjust the lever. Like the 100-ton tank, the project was contracted to Mitsubishi. But due to the war situation, the project was cancelled before prototype completion. Weighing as much as 150 tons and crewed by 11 men, it fitted most aspects of the French fortress tank concept. Dimensions were 10.1 meters long, 4 meters high, 2.5 meters WO turret, and track width 0.9 meters. Ground pressure was 1.20 kilograms per square centimeter. The two-type, 98,550 horsepower, aircraft engines modified WWII air-cooled V12, produced a maximum speed of 24 kilometers per hour. The armor scheme involved turret, armor estimated by some sources up to 200 millimeters all round, with front hull armor of 200 millimeters thick, with sides 110 millimeters or 75 millimeters and 35 millimeters plates, added for a total thickness of 110 millimeters. Weapons were one 105 millimeters cannon, Type 147 millimeters tank gun, and three 7.7 mm machine guns. The Type 92 cannon as a field gun was of 105 millimeters L45 caliber, with 765 meters muzzle velocity and a maximum range of 18,200 meters. The guns, high explosive round, weighed 16 kilograms, and the armor-piercing round penetrate 175 millimeters of armor at 100 meters. The American T-28 during World War II, the U.S. Army resisted most efforts to place a heavy tank into operation. The development and mass production of medium tanks were seen as the key to victory, and the concept generally found satisfaction with field commands. The difficult encounters with the heavy King Tiger and Panther medium tanks in Europe changed some of this policy, but the Army ground forces tended to oppose any tank approaching the 50 to 70-ton range. The Ordnance Department, however, saw a particular need for a special assault tank capable of dealing with fortifications once the Allies had established their armies ashore in France. In September 1943, concept and design work began on a vehicle designed to deal with the expected works off the West Wall and other conceivable German strongholds. Early concepts called for use of the new T5E 105 mm cannon that performed very well against armor and reinforced concrete, with frontal armor 203 mm thick. The resulting vehicle would require the electric drive installed in the T1E1 heavy tank and T23 medium tank. The Ordnance Department proposed building 25 such vehicles in time for them to be used after the invasion of Europe, advocating a sizable number of such vehicles in the event that enemy fortifications had to be overcome. Army ground forces did not agree, and preferred the construction of 3 pilot vehicles using conventional mechanical drives. In March 1944, the design was approved for 5 pilot vehicles of the Special Assault Tank, designated Heavy Tank T-28. Among many departures from conventional designs, this tank was designed without a turret in order to lower the height of an otherwise huggy. The positioning of the gun far forward also allowed advantages of castings and shaping the hull against penetrations on front and sides. The 105 mm gun would have at least 10 degrees of traverse to each side and elevation between +20 and -5 degrees. A crew of 4 was considered suitable for the vehicle, driver and gunner, positioned to the left and right of the gun, and the vehicle commander behind the gunner. The loader worked in the left rear of the compartment. Only the driver and commander had vision balas, and the commanders included a 12.7 mm machine gun that required him to stand in an exposed position. This was the only other vehicle weapon. So T-28 was clearly designed for engagements at a distance and under escort. The gunner had both periscope and telescope type sights. At his position, left and rear of the gun, the loader also had a vision periscope. With a single loader and heavy separate loading ammunition, a rate of fire of 4 shots per minute was the maximum expected. The engine provided was the same as that used in the M26 medium tank, leaving the T-28 underpowered with a top speed of 12.9 km per hour. In order to reduce the ground pressure, a second set of tracks was provided, with the 102 mm side skirt armor included, and these were attached to the hull side in approximately 2.5 hours, when not needed or for rail transport. The extra tracks were linked together and towed as a trailer. In January 1945, Major General Gladian M. Barnes, Chief of Research and Development of the Ordnance Department, advised the head of that the startling performance of the new tungsten, now in use by the German Army, left the T-28 to vulnerable. He recommended increasing the frontal armor to 305 mm. He confided that Corps of Engineers was developing bridging capable of supporting tanks Mach heavier than 80 tons. Shortly thereafter, the Chief of Ordnance Actido changed the designation of the T-28 heavy tank to the T-95 gun Mo**. After some difficulty in locating a manufacturer not fully occupied with, Ordnance contracted the Pacific Car and Foundry Company fourth construction of the 5 pilots of the T-95 in March. Packard produced the casting of the front end on June 20th and completed the welding of the first hull in August. Final weight was 86.2 metric tons. Combat loaded. The end of the Pacific War brought cutbacks to all ordnance programs and the number of T-95 pilots dropped to 2, with pilot number 1 delivered to Aberdeen Proving Ground on December 21, 1945, and the second down on January 10, 1946, with no need for breakthrough. tanks or fortress tanks of any kind. The Army used them for engineering tests at Aberdeen, Fort Knox, and elsewhere. In June 1946, the vehicle was again redesignated under yet another Army nomenclature change, now qualifying in the 80 short-ton range as the sole Super Heavy Tank, T-28. Testing continued at Aberdeen and Yuma, proving grounds to determine wear of heavy tank components until late in 1947. Polo 2 was lost to an engine fire and scrapped at Yuma. Pilot Vehicle 1, assigned to Aberdeen Proving Ground, was simply lost in the records for many years, variously reported as destroyed or scrapped, until a conscientious lieutenant at Fort Beaver conducting inventory wandered into a disused range in 1974, and Medea, most unusual discovery, removed to Fort Knox for restoration and display. This odd surviving T-28 now forms part of Fort Benning's National Armor and Cavalry Museum. Britain's Tortoise, a 39, the British Tortoise heavy assault tank forms a convenient close to this study, which for the World War II period began with the TOG and its similar origins. The British Army from time to time embraced the notion of assault tanks, which took the form generally of a conventional tank fitted with additional armor to resist the most numerous anti-tank guns of the German army, and Dalo had a chance to overcome prepared defensive positions and outclass defending armored vehicles. None of these conventional assault tank schemes effectively dealt with the prospect of overcoming the German West Wall fortifications. Therefore, as in the case of the U.S., the British Army engaged in special development of a tank that exceeded all norms of size and complexity for that particular mission. The general concept was issued to industry in March 1943. The contract for the A-39 vehicle that took the name Tortoise from its shape and was the last of 16 concept designs reviewed in 1943-44. More concepts existed, but were heavy flamethrower vehicles. Once determined, the design was engineered, and construction began on 25 vehicles for use in 1945. The progress of the war caught up with projects and passed by the program, and only 6 machines were completed, with deliveries starting in 1946. British, POR2IS. The Tortoise heavy assault tank represented a return to the fortress tank concept of 1939, with same specific challenge of the German West Wall in mind. Dimensions: the tank measured 10.06 meters. Overall 7 meters without gun in length, 3.89 meters in width, 2.87 meters in height. Performance: ground clearance was 0.38 meters and track width 0.91 meters. This vehicle crossed 2.44 meters, forded 1.37 meters water, and climbed a 0.91 meters obstacle. Ground pressure was 0.88 kilograms per square centimeter. Radius of action was 140 kilometers on roads, with 530 liters of fuel. Top speed was 17 kilometers per hour. Armor protection: the fighting compartment consisted of a single large casting 15.88 metric tons, with 279 to 203 millimeters at 0 to 47.5 degrees, 178 to 156 millimeters sides at 85 degrees, and 120 millimeters vertical. The hull front is 228 millimeters, rounded. Lower sides are 112 millimeters. Side suspension skirts, 101 millimeters. Rear engine compartment casting is 120 millimeters. Top armor ranges between 33 millimeters and 50 millimeters, and bottom is 35 millimeters. Reflecting the experience to date in World War II, the Tortoise emphasized maximum armor protection and exceptional firepower, and accepted the low speed, mobility, and weight penalties that no other tank produced in the United Kingdom had been allowed to display. As with the contemporary US T-28, a turretless design took shape, built around a very powerful gun not yet fielded in tanks, protected by massive armored hull and superstructure castings. A significant difference, however, was the provision of machine gun positions that indicated more of a close combat role for this machine than its American counterpart. The provision of a tank in France confirmed this intention. The large single castings for the front hull transmission gearbox and superstructure crew, fighting compartment and rear engine compartment were assembled into an all-welded vehicle, with a dual torsion bar suspension and 0.91 meters wide steel pin track. Side armor plates covered the suspension to a very high degree. The main armament consisted of a modified Ordnance 3.7 and 32 PDR 93.4 mm heavy anti-aircraft gun, with a 62 caliber barrel length. The Rolls-Royce Meteor MKV powered the vehicle with 650 bhp at 2,500 revolutions per minute. But even with a combat weight of 78 metric tons, the top speed remained a somewhat respectable 19 kilometers per hour, as of action did not exceed 1 for OKM. Troop test in 1948 of 2 Tortoise tanks, with the British Army of the Rhine, proved the closest this tank came to operations. It was well liked for its mechanical reliability and firepower, but the weight and size of the vehicle made its transport and maneuvering simply too much to handle. As with all super heavies, The roads and towns suffered much ill treatment, similar to its American counterpart. The tortoise supported much ordnance and engineering study. Above all, the 32 PDR cannon provided interesting proofs for armor piercing, discarding sabot ammunition of very high velocities. Proof firings in 1946 of a 1 to 1.76 subcaliber penetrator. The largest Theno attempted produced muzzle velocities of 1,524 meters per second, slightly over the planned one, 448 m per second. The sabot segments discarded out to 300 meters, but the base flew over 1,000 meters, an evident troop hazard. The penetrations of 200 mm homogeneous plate succeeded at 1,280 meters per second at a 40-degree angle, but higher target angles produced shattering, indicating the need for much more research before attack with super high velocities could be attempted. The standard capped armor-piercing shot for the gun had much greater accuracy than the 20 PDR 84 mm, with discarding sabot ammunition, and was even better at longer ranges. Tests of the pre-production superstructure frontal and side protection. In late 1945 against 17 PD, 3.7 in and German, 8.8 centimeters, Pak 43 shots, met all specifications of the design. Once the brittle hardness had been reduced from 282 to 252.55, cracking problems ceased. The side armor resisted 17 BHR more piercing rounds, and the frontal armor resisted the 3.7 inches and 8.8 ammunition at near maximum velocities. Stowage of ammunition remained problematic for Tortoise. None of the 60 projectiles had a ready ammunition location, and only 12 cartridges qualified as such. With all the rest under the compartment floor, machine gun ammo totaled 7,500 rounds. In addition, the machine gun cupola required redesign for better ventilation. On the positive side, the 32 bracers were visible to 2,926 meters, and barrel life was classified as long if stowage could be improved. A rate of fire of 6 to 8 rounds per minute could have been accomplished by the two loaders. Smoke screening equipment was generous, including a 2 inches trainable mortar and 3/6 tuba self-screening smoke projectors. Today, one Tortoise may be seen in running condition at the Tank Museum. Bovington, a most impressive accomplishment. It was last used in firing trials at Larkill in 1949. One other is hulked at the Kirkcudbright Military Training Area in Scotland, probably not